Good morning, everybody. We're going to go ahead and get started. It's 8:15, so if we can turn our attention up here. Again, we're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Nick Ponder. I'm the Legislative Director with the League of Arizona Cities and Towns. The session was intended to be presided by Satish Iremath from Oro Valley, the Mayor of Oro Valley. However, he was unable to attend, so lucky you get me. Yeah. So handouts for this session and all sessions are available on our app. So if you go on the League's conference app, you'll be able to get the handouts for the session as well as biographical information for anybody that speaks. And one thing that we ask in every session is to either turn off or turn on vibrate your cell phone so that it's not interrupting the speaker. The topic to be discussed here is state preemption, local autonomy, and the ghost of Judge Dillon. What's a local government to do? We're painfully aware of the way our state legislature sometimes seems to interfere in city and town affairs. Our speaker this morning has been studying this phenomenon, not only in Arizona, but around the country, and will share with us ideas and possible solutions on how we, as a local elected officials, can most optimally work in today's political environment. Our speaker today is David Swindell. He's a director and an associate professor at the Center for Urban Innovation at Arizona State University. Please welcome David. I'm going to turn it over to him.
And I actually do have another handout that won't be on the app, so share this. Thank you. Well, I appreciate everybody coming out. For the first session is always a risk given things that typically happen the night before. I really enjoy these meetings because it is such a great opportunity to network with so many of you all who are actually in the trenches doing the work that we only get to talk about at the university level for that next generation of local leaders that we're trying to cultivate. And so my hat's always off to you all, and I like telling the stories about what happens the nights of these kinds of conferences because that's when the really good stuff, that's when the good stories come out and they can really learn what's going on at the local level of government, which really gets them going about it. It's one of the things I love about teaching local government, much more so than state and federal stuff, is this is where the action is. This is where you have a direct impact on people's lives that you can actually see and derive that thrill from the public service that really fuels so much of their enthusiasm for local government work. So I thought, let's see here. Okay, so what you're seeing and what I'm seeing is slightly different. I want to tell you just a little bit about where this effort came from. And I noticed that much like my classes, you all have gravitated toward the back. So I'm going to, it's a little more formal setup than I was expecting. So I'm going to talk up here for a little while, but then I'll probably just grab that other mic and just maybe walk around a little bit. But as I go through this material, some of it's kind of dense. So if you have any questions at all, please feel free to chime in. And you all are living this stuff, so you all are going to know a lot more of the in the weeds details of this that I hope we can have some sharing across the jurisdictional lines, so to speak. So if at any point you have questions like that, please feel free. I would like to try and facilitate as much of a discussion of this as possible as we go through, simply because it's a bit of a challenge in this kind of setup. But I'm going to tell you a little bit of background as to why we're doing this. I direct the Center for Urban Innovation, and quite frankly, state preemption of local autonomy is nothing new. It's been going on for a long time. We go through cycles of it. It's kind of in a cycle right now where the pendulum is swinging heavily towards the states in terms of the centralization of authority. And the bad news that I'm sure will come as no surprise to anyone in this room is that Arizona is leading the way. We're the tip of the spear in a sense that other states are looking to see how to take power away from local governments. So it's a little disconcerting to be here and in a state with the political history that we have, to be the state that's actually historically been a very strong home rule state that has given a lot of autonomy to local governments, to now be in this era where we're seeing so many intrusions by state government into local affairs is challenging to say the least. There's a lack of experience on how to deal with that, and what I've tried to do through the Center for Urban Innovation, where we work nationally, is to look to other states and see what they've been doing, lessons that we can learn from them. And what I'm going to talk about today is some of those lessons that we've distilled from some of their experiences. We face a specific challenge, though, in Arizona, and that is, was it 1487, sorry, that is rather crippling, and other state leagues are absolutely aghast that this has been passed here. It's a paralytic has a paralytic effect on local governments. So we'll talk more about that as we go on. So the Center for Urban Innovation is part of the School of Public Affairs and the College of Public Service and Community Solutions. We're designed around doing applied work to help local communities. We do that here in the Phoenix area, in the Valley, but we do it statewide also. We do projects all across the state. But again, most of what we're doing is trying to bring lessons from other parts of the country to our local governments to provide options for them. How can we adapt solutions that have been tried in other places and test them here, see how they work here, see if we can improve upon those, and then turn those lessons around to other states as well across the country. One of the things that we did over the last few years since I've been here is we had created an experiment called the Local Government Research Collaborative. Phoenix was one of the founding members of this. We had 21 local governments from around the country and a couple from Canada that came together to put $5,000 a year into a research fund, just to say, we want to do research on X. Not surprisingly, 21 local government leaders, these are pretty much city managers that came together, had a hard time deciding on what X was going to be. So we covered in our experimental phase over 2 years, several different kinds of topics, the last of which is this preemption topic. So this is the final project of the Local Government Research Collaborative, the LGRC, that is composed of these 21 local governments coordinated by the Center for Urban Innovation in partnership with the ICMA and the Alliance for Innovation, which we also happen to house at ASU, which is an independent nonprofit organization composed of 250 jurisdictions from around North America. And these are the jurisdictions that really drink the Kool-Aid on innovation. They want to try new stuff, and we help them design new stuff to try with their member organizations and evaluate how is it working, what's working, what didn't work. The state preemption was in reaction to a lot of frustrations that not only our Arizona jurisdictions are facing, but jurisdictions across the country are facing. You have states like Texas and North Carolina that are also vying for the role of poster child for state preemption. Right now we're king of the hill, but we got a couple of states that are coming after us. They want to take the title. So at the same time that we were working on this, the National League of Cities released a report that some of you may have seen on this very topic. They looked at the past couple of years to see what was going on, and they found, oh yes, there's this increase in state preemption of local autonomy. And they looked at some very specific areas. Ours looks further back in time, and you'll see some of the results of our work. And it also looks at a broader array of different topics than just the NLC's report. So, without further background, let me jump into what it is I'm going to talk about here. First, a little bit about the nature of this debate, because we are all, probably in this room, most of us are kind of sympathetic to the local side of this argument. But there is another side of the argument, and the question is, where's the balance? Again, I mentioned already, historically we go through these periods where there's more power given to local governments, and then there's periods where more power is taken away from local governments, and right now we are definitely in one of those latter periods. I'll talk a little bit about our research that we've been doing over the last year on this topic. Excuse me. Which is designed to really help local leaders see where they fit. Now, again, our work has been national in scope, and I'm not going to pick heavily on Arizona, because most of the stuff you'll know in the Arizona case, but I am going to highlight some of the things that Arizona is doing relative to what other states are doing as well, so you'll see where we fit into the larger national context. And then I'll wrap up talking about some of the things that other states have been doing to try and counter some of the activities that state governments have been undertaking that have thwarted some of their activities. And like I said, we're not alone in this. We have had some interesting comments by some of our state legislators with regards to local autonomy and their lack of interest in that topic, but none have come out quite as vociferously as Governor Abbott of Texas, who literally came out and said, we need to take away the ability of local governments to write law. No more local ordinances. Period. Stop. That's a pretty extreme version, because now you're talking literally about getting rid of local government and running the entire state of Texas out of Austin. Now, I actually come from Texas, and I know that there's this, during the Obama years, there was a lot of talk about secession again. Texas loves to do that. It's a whole other country. For those of you who are familiar with Texas, you know it has a bit of an attitude. But the irony is that, of course, the city of Austin has frequently talked about wanting to secede from the state of Texas. This is not healthy. The debate that we're in right now, and I'll give you some more examples of where cities and counties are making secessionary arguments from their states, which are making secessionary arguments from the nation. I mean, it's very fragmenting, this discussion that we're getting into these days. So Governor Abbott is kind of an extreme example of a state leader who is pretty hell-bent on trying to strip local government of their authority. Now, again, most of these frustrations that Governor Abbott has targeted typically are at the larger cities: Houston, Dallas, San Antonio, Austin, which is the bluest of the blue in the urban areas of Texas. He's okay with Fort Worth. They're Republican. So it's very politicized there, very aimed at urban areas, and has a bit of a racial component in it because of who lives in those racial areas. And it's not just about Democrats and Republicans, it's also about different ethnic groups that typically are home to those cities. So we have some challenges in our leadership in the state legislators. We have different attitudes with regards to our local employees. And when we've done some surveys, there was a study done of like 1,200 local government workers in the state of Michigan, for instance. In Michigan, it's traditionally a home rule state. It's been one of the model home rule states, used to be at least. It hasn't been the case more recently. A lot of examples of where the state has intruded, including, of course, probably the ultimate expression of state control when they put in an emergency manager for the city of Detroit and for Flint and another community as well. So they use that emergency manager provision in their state law more so than other states have in the recent past. And that's, of course, the most extreme version of preemption. So in asking how the current overall relationship between your state and your local jurisdiction is, the Michigan survey, as well as a survey of folks when we first did this presentation to a group of city managers from across the nation, we found that about a third said it's good, but 2/3 fair or poor. I mean, it's not healthy. And this is nationally. This is not. If I did this in Arizona, I suspect those numbers would be even worse if I had to guess, based on conversations that I've had with many of you all. And another question that we've asked is, state government is taking away too much, how much they agree or disagree, that state government is taking away too much decision-making authority from local governments. And again, not surprisingly, local government officials, by a vast number, agree with that statement. They do believe that that's the case, both nationally and from the study in Michigan itself. These numbers line up really well. Michigan is a really good bellwether for this. The irony, one of the ironies, is that citizens right now, today in America, across the nation, from a survey taken this year, are saying that they don't trust the states as much as they trust local governments. The most trust that citizens have in government is at the local level. handily. And of course, that's way above what they trust Congress right now, which is at its historically low levels of trust. So there's some issues with regards to where the citizens are, where the state legislators are, and where local government officials are. And if we ask the state legislators about this, we find that this isn't even on their radar. This is not a topic, that they're not having sessions at their conferences to talk about local autonomy. It's simply not an issue for them. This is, in many cases, the legislators on that side would be arguing that when this topic is brought up, is that why is this being brought up? This is basic federalism. There are 2 levels of government, not 3, federal and state. And local governments are nothing more than an extension of the state, which goes to some of the historical stuff I'll talk about here in just a second. So we have this big disconnect from all these different components of our communities across the nation. I mentioned kind of the extreme example of preemption is the takeover of a city by the state. Typically on a temporary basis, Detroit is out of this receivership now. They've got their local control back after several years being under Kevin Orr, who was the emergency manager, but that did some damage. There are a host of issues where we're seeing this intrusion, and it had really gotten going early, about 15 years ago is when it really started picking up steam with the advent of fracking. Even though we've been fracking for a long time, local governments had started to try and regulate that from happening within their city boundaries. In Oklahoma and Texas, for instance, Denton, Texas was kind of the epicenter, if you'll excuse the pun, of where this had been tried. They had tried to control fracking, and the state legislature, or the state Supreme Court rather, ultimately ruled that local governments do not have the authority to stop fracking within those city boundaries, given what the state has said, where the state has said fracking can take place. Well, now then, 15 years later, pretty much every state has basically bans on local fracking for the most part. There are a couple that allow local governments to do it, but mainly this has been asked and answered now. Fracking is no longer the issue it used to be. But the one that got the most national attention came out of Charlotte, North Carolina, when the city tried to pass, or did pass, an ordinance saying that people of whatever gender you identify with, for transgendered individuals, they can use whatever bathroom they identify with. That caused an immediate reaction by one of the state legislators representing a pretty small portion of the city, who went and within weeks had a piece of legislation not simply drafted, but passed and signed by the governor. That became the infamous HB 2 bathroom bill. That has since been pulled back a little bit on a temporary basis, but the reaction of the legislature was not only to overturn the ordinance, but to also preempt the rest of the state from doing anything similar to what Charlotte had tried to do. And what Charlotte had tried to do was not about bathrooms. That was just one piece of this. The piece of the ordinance was actually about workers' rights and benefits to workers. So it had more to do also with things like paid holidays and overtime and employment contracting. The legislature swept the whole thing under this larger umbrella, and that created all sorts of problems, not just for the city of Charlotte, but for all local governments, cities, counties, special districts, and the higher education system, the UNC system, the University of North Carolina system, which also got hit by this. So this is still an issue. The bathroom bill is still a bit of an issue that North Carolina is wrestling with, but other states have passed similar bills to take away the authority of local governments to actually regulate this particular space. Tennessee and Arkansas being those are the 2 states who now have effectively put bathroom bills in place, and several other legislatures that are debating how to do the same thing. So again, this is one of those, so fracking is resolved, but we've got bathroom bills, and we've got a whole host of other things I'll be showing you here in a second that are still bubbling and percolating, that we don't have any reason to believe that Arizona is going to slow down, or that any of these other state governments are going to slow down. One of the big areas right now is on gun control, and it has been for a while. Local gun control ordinances have been tried and shot down, again, forgive the pun, many times. And local governments lose way more often than they win in this area. And of course, here in Arizona, we had the story out of Tucson, summer before last, with regards to, or last summer, I guess, with regards to their attempts to destroy guns that they had in storage. And the state investigated, the AG's office investigated, and found against Tucson that they were in violation of state law, and they have to resell those guns. Which, again, not something that local governments are really designed well to do. That's just not, well, that's not how we operate typically. So the efforts to save the guns is working not only in Arizona but in other states as well. We have a lot of states that have these very similar kinds of prohibitions about what it is that we do with guns that are confiscated in the course of a crime, or that are simply aged out. Most states now are banning local government's authority to regulate in the gun space. And we have very little data to understand why, the impacts of this. We're prohibited from collecting a lot of data on shootings and on gun deaths. We have a lot of barriers that have been erected for reasons that we'll get into here shortly, because those reasons are not only about guns and the gun lobby, it's about all these other areas and business interests that go along with that as well. Sick days. We have a lot of preemption bills on sick days, and these data are actually out of date. There's a couple of states that have passed bills in the last couple of years, on additional bills on this in the last couple of years as well. So local governments cannot change from what state law is with regards to. They can't say, okay, well, state law says you have to allow for X number of paid sick days. We can't offer more, even if we're trying to attract different kinds of workers to our workforce to work in our local governments. Don't have that latitude. Minimum wages. This is another big one. And of course, this is one where we actually had some interesting developments here in Arizona, where local governments had tried to increase local minimum wages, got challenged, and then ended up doing a statewide referendum, which we're going to come back to that also as actions that can be taken in the face of some of these challenges that state governments are putting in front of us. But a lot of states are wrestling with this. This is, again, you can see where many states are preventing local governments from engaging in providing higher than base levels of minimum wage. Obviously, everybody has to meet the federal level, but some states have a slightly higher minimum wage level. Some local governments where the cost of living is higher might want to have a higher minimum wage. I mean, I love this slide from Los Angeles, where they bumped the minimum wage from $2.50 to $12. $12 an hour in Los Angeles? That doesn't go very far compared to, say, Modesto, California, where $12 can get you a lot farther. So it's the idea that an entire state is homogeneous in terms of its cost of living is a pretty flawed assumption. I think we can all agree on that. In terms of both the workforce, in terms of the cost of living, there's all sorts of problems with treating an entire state as a uniform district, which is why we have local governments to begin with, one of the reasons. Another area, affordable housing, that we've seen a lot of action lately. There's been a great deal of attention given to trying to provide affordable housing, particularly in communities where the cost of living is so high. This is a huge issue in Silicon Valley, where the cost of living is absurd. I mean, it's comically absurd. But even in more moderate communities, there's frequently an affordable housing crisis that we have simply been unable to address adequately. And so many communities have tried all sorts of ways to deal with the lack of affordable housing by providing, say, subsidies or doing adjusted assessments for certain kinds of housing, so that the tax rates are, the effective taxes that are being paid by the people who live in those are lower, and those communities that are trying those efforts are frequently being thwarted by their state legislature saying, no, we do not want to do that, which means effectively that affordable housing is not something then that is easily accomplished by the communities that need it most. And again, this is happening across the majority of states now, where there are bans being put on local governments from the ability to operate in that affordable housing space, trying to address the needs of citizens that live in these communities where there is a lack of affordable housing and keeps them in poverty when they can't actually live, or increases the homeless rate. Another fun hot topic: soda taxes, beverage taxes. This is one again. We've dealt with this here in Arizona as well. Many states have these laws in place. New York has gotten a lot of attention in theirs simply because it's interesting where the city of New York has wanted to tax beverages, and the state governor, also a Democrat, has said, no, do not do that. We don't want you to. The legislature and the governor have taken, even though New York has home rule provision, the city of New York has a home rule provision, the state legislature has come in and said, nope, you're not going to be able to do that. That's not a revenue source that we're going to give you access to. But again, just targeting specifically New York City there. But Arizona has a pretty blanket statement with regards to local regulation of promotional items, broadly speaking. So toys, games, coupons, crayons, coloring books, prizes at restaurants and stores that sell food. So you can't tax unhealthy items unless you're taxing all the items in those categories. It's a clever way of effectively prohibiting a soda tax, which some argue has some health benefits that can actually fund additional health to deal with diabetes problems, for instance, which is what New York was arguing. Another completely non-controversial topic that is getting a lot of attention these days: sanctuary cities. The idea that a state can go in and tell local governments, you must comply with the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency, ICE, to tell when undocumented prisoners are being held so that ICE can pick them up and for potential deportation. And this has happened in many states where some cities have said, we're not going to comply with that state requirement. This is a challenge both to states as well as the federal government, as Attorney General Jeff Sessions has lodged multiple lawsuits against multiple cities, including several states, Illinois, California, to name a couple, for failure to comply. But like I mentioned before, this is kind of a divisive topic, this whole preemption thing, and this is one of those areas where it is very unhealthy for the Republic, because you have a state like California, which has declared itself a sanctuary state, and is telling its local governments, you will not tell ICE when we have undocumented people in custody, whether they're convicted or not. That's a separate issue. If you have undocumented people in custody, you will not tell ICE. Well, not all the communities in California agree with that policy that the state's doing. So this is kind of the inverse of what we've talked about in Arizona and what's been talked about in Texas. In California, it's kind of the opposite, where you have Orange County and several of the municipalities in Orange County that are saying, we actually want to comply with ICE. We want to comply with the federal government, and we want to tell them, but we are prohibited by our state from doing so. So I'll tell you a little later, in terms of our solutions on how to deal with state preemption, their workaround for that problem. So, so stay tuned on that one. But it is an issue where some states have gotten very kind of pretty pissed off about this, and Texas was one of those. The state Supreme Court has said that no cities cannot do this, that they cannot not comply. And so the state legislature passed legislation there saying that if you do not comply, then not only are we going to withhold general revenue funds from you, we are also going to hold you, city councilor, or you, chief of police, personally liable for fines and jail time for failure to comply. Now we're talking penalties, direct penalties on individuals where your umbrella protections do not apply. Another issue that we are familiar with here in Arizona, given what happened in Bisbee, is the bans on bag bans. That's a tongue twister. The ban on bag bans. So we have an interesting situation here, but we have it in many communities, particularly, much like Bisbee, communities that rely on tourism. We see this in places like the Outer Banks of North Carolina, where many of the communities there have tried to ban bags along the coastal communities there because it's bad for the fish, it's bad for the environment, and it looks horrible in these communities that have bags flying around everywhere. We see them all over the community here, even in Scottsdale, which is a generally clean city. We see plastic bags blowing around every so often. So North Carolina said, oh no, Outer Banks communities, not only can you not ban those bags, no other communities in the state can either. So it was not just a nullification, but it was also a preemption against other communities that might have wanted to pass these bans. And of course, here in Bisbee, we have the case where Bisbee challenged that, this state ban on bans, that they wanted to ban the bags, and they actually had done so for some time and had seen an improvement in the quality of the local environment. Fewer bags blowing around. These things don't biodegrade. So this is a challenge for the aesthetics of a community, but it's also an environmental hazard. So that's one area where I think we've seen a lot of debates, but not all cities are facing this. Park City, Utah, where Sundance Festival is a ski resort outside of Salt Lake, they passed a bag ban. And sure enough, a legislator led the charge to create a statewide ban on bags. And then the Republican Utah legislature said, no, Park City wants a ban on bags. That's Park City's business. Wow, what a novel concept. Local autonomy. I don't think anybody expected that. So it's not impossible. There are some happy endings to some of these stories. But the stories, these, and it covers a whole huge breadth of areas. I didn't even get into like the animal breeds, issues that even here in Arizona we're dealing with, pet stores and selling certain breeds or not selling certain breeds. It's fascinating to study this, but of course it's also important to remember that it directly affects individuals' lives, and it has implications for property values of homeowners, it has implications for business owners and how it is that they operate, and a lot of times these are involving actors that we, at the local level, are fairly ignorant of, that we don't know why some of these things are being promulgated. Why are some of these bans on local autonomy being pursued when it wasn't even an issue? It wasn't on anybody's radar. But this is a debate that goes all the way back to this guy named Judge Dillon. Judge Dillon was the Supreme Court, the Chief Justice of the Iowa State Supreme Court in the 1860s. This is an old story, and actually he predates him some too, but he was the guy who sat down a doctrine that established the idea that cities are creatures of the state. His idea was, and he was living in a time where some of the cities were beginning to develop what we now affectionately refer to as political machines. Right? These were the big cities in the 1800s, in the late 1800s, had these machines that were just very anti-democratic, very authoritarian, and he thought that was bad. And so one way to protect against that is by making sure that the state legislatures, which are more egalitarian, would make sure that the cities behaved themselves to try and bring those cities under control. So this was not an issue in Iowa. I'm not sure there were any cities in Iowa in the 1880s, but there were not a lot of machines going on there, but he was concerned about things that were happening in other states. So this case involved a railroad in Cedar Rapids, a little town which had like a population of 4,000 at the time. So we're not talking about New York City or Boss Tweed or anything like that. This was a little case that became the foundation for everything that we're talking about today in preemption. His rule, this Dillon's rules, what we call that, is the idea that cities are creatures of the state. They are simply administrative extensions of state government. There is not, the word city does not appear in the U.S. Constitution, right? This is not, we have a two-tiered system of government in this country. It's federal, it's national, and it's state. That's messy enough as it is. And then local governments are nothing more than these administrative arms of the states. So this goes back to what he said, where these municipal corporations, and it's important that we remember that word corporation, because that is how many cities today are hanging their hats on this the corporate nature of cities. We are corporations to get around some of the some of the preemptions that are happening. So municipal corporations are the creatures, mere political subdivisions of the state for the purpose of exercising a part of the state's powers. So basically the state says, okay, well, we need to deal with zoning. We need to make sure that we protect zoning, so we're going to create this administrative unit called a municipality, and that municipality is going to take care of the zoning within those boundaries. But that's kind of the state specifically granting that authority to the local government. That's the way Judge Dillon saw this. They're essential. They are, in every essential sense, only auxiliaries of the state for the purpose of local government. They are created by the state, and they can be dissolved by the state. In fact, we've seen some of these dissolutions of municipalities and special districts over the last few years in various states. Now, for every action, there's an opposite but equal reaction. There, at the same time, in the late 1800s, was a reactionary movement to this that came out of the West, namely in California, Missouri, and later Arizona, that argued for home rule. This idea that, well, if a power is not specifically denied to a local government, the local government should be able to do it. That was the kind of the fundamental premise, which is the same fundamental premise as Article 9 of the Constitution. If the federal Constitution doesn't say a state can't do it, then the state can do it. Same basic argument. So there was this counter-argument, and this argument arose on the West because people were upset with what the railroads were doing. Again, it's all about the railroads. What the railroads were doing to a lot of the cities. They were dictating. There's a really cool history for those history buffs out there in Arizona with regards to why is Phoenix the capital. It used to be in Prescott. It used to be in Tucson. It used to be hither and thither. And where the railroads were had a lot to do with where the cities developed and where the capital sat and all that. And it goes back to this period when we were arguing about local control. How much authorities do local governments have? So you have this other side of the argument. So you have these two different ideas. But it's important to understand that today, there's no such thing as a pure Dillon's rule state or a pure home rule state. There's no such thing. You've got to think of it as a continuum and with a lot of overlap. You can have a Dillon's rule state where the state has a lot of control at the local level, but certain things that have been farmed out for the local governments to do as they see fit. And you have some home rule states where the state legislature is coming in and taking powers away. I'm giving you some examples of that already. So it's important, it's not a dichotomous choice that you're going to be in this box or that box. You're going to be along a continuum somewhere, and all states are being pushed, even the democratic states are being pushed more towards the Dillon's rule side of the spectrum. Okay. So I have these two general philosophical approaches, but there are reasons for this. I told you before, I know we in here typically probably lean towards the sympathetic position of local government, needing some autonomy. But there are reasons why that states have for making sure that states are responsible for these public responsibilities. So some of these include some arguments for Dillon's rule, for state control over local governments, is that statewide policy, particularly in terms of the regulation of businesses, creates a better business climate. This is what we hear the most often, not only in Arizona, but in every state that's dealing with these issues. We want a uniform business climate, as if we can't vary from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, that somehow businesses are not used to that, even though we've been doing it for a couple of centuries now. But the idea that we need to standardize everything as if states are homogenous, that there's, we want that Phoenix is just the same as Yuma, which is just the same as Prescott, which is just the same as Havasu. It's a bit of a stretch, right? These are very different communities. Even within Arizona, we have actual variation from community to community. It allows states to grant authority to local governments to be the lead agencies on very local scale issues. So states theoretically can grant specific powers to specific jurisdictions that have specific needs, but they can tailor it that way if they're paying close enough attention as opposed to just putting down a blanket statement. But the argument is that you can tailor to the needs of the local communities if you're sensitive enough to that. It requires a lot of special legislation, though, targeting each of these different communities for their special needs. Dillon's rule can provide local governments cover for not acting on the desires of the community when what that community wants is bad for the jurisdiction. This was much more of an argument back in the 60s when we were also having a push towards more state control because many local governments, particularly in the South, were behaving badly. Some states were behaving badly too, but many local governments were behaving badly as we were going through a period of strife with regards to civil rights legislation that the feds were passing, and local governments were not complying with that. So state control would then help those local governments come along without getting themselves into federal trouble. Dillon's rule allows state governments to curb the worst aspects of irresponsible, corrupt, and uncooperative local governments, because there's never been a case of corruption at the state level of any state. We're going to go on past that one. Dillon's rule allows states to protect individual rights that could too easily be trampled by the parochial nature of local communities. Local communities are more homogeneous. And so we do have some communities that are, 99% white. I'll use this random example. And there's a lot of these communities in the South where you might have a black family that wanted to move in and got harassed significantly, and the local government didn't do anything about it. So the state government would intercede in order to prevent a federal lawsuit. This is much more the case in the 60s and the 70s, but that is still an argument you hear today as to one of the reasons why the state can play an important role to protect the local governments. Okay, so, also home rule advantages suburban communities while placing central cities in disadvantageous positions. This is, again, has a lot to do with how we divide up our states into political jurisdictions, and how sometimes, if you've noticed, that large central city areas, and this is not just in Arizona, but nationally, this tends to happen, the legislatures will divide up the state so that a piece of the central cities are carved into a district that is heavily suburban or exurban, so that the legislatures are made up much more of rural and suburban interests than the central city interests, which is where most of the people live. One person, one vote has not really been our forte, historically speaking. Now, just like there are lots of arguments on the Dillon's rule side, there are a lot of arguments on the home rule side. And these are ones that I think you all probably are more familiar with regards to the role that local communities should be allowed to vary in order to create stronger laboratories for innovation. This is where the action is. This is where we are learning how to solve problems, much more so than we are at the state level or the federal level. The feds are not good at innovation. The states are pretty poor at it. But local governments, 34,000 of them. Of municipalities alone. There were another 3,000 counties and another 35,000 special districts. We got a lot of laboratories for innovation and experimentation. But if you blanket regulations to create these blanket policies for states, then you limit the ability of local governments to innovate. You curb their ability to tailor their taxes to match their needs, their service needs. Empowering local governments to run their own local affairs means that state government will be free to focus on state matters. So they will stay basically butt out of local matters. Nice in theory, but again, in the real world, that really is not the case because, of course, legislators are elected at the local level in weirdly shaped districts. Local governments with control over their own local finances will create greater responsiveness by local officials to citizens' demands rather than state officials who are far removed from the community. This is, again, the ability to tailor the local cost of living, if you will, the local cost of doing government's work with the preferences of the citizens that live in that area. So if you have the capacity and the desire, if you want some really high-end schools, then and your citizens are willing to pay for it, why can't they? That's one argument for local control. Some feel that businesses and outside interests are using... Oh, wait, before I go on to that, this local finance control issue is... I want to highlight the importance of this, because in public policy, one of the things that we always teach is that, and you've probably heard the adage about follow the money, whoever controls the purse strings controls the policy. Period. And when state governments are actually taking away the ability of local governments to enhance revenues or limit how much they can increase their taxes, even if their citizens in that local area want their taxes higher for this particularly this big service that they want, or this new thing that they want, or this increase in police that they want, if they're hamstrung by the state legislature in terms of their ability to raise those additional revenues, then they're not going to be able to meet the needs of their citizens. There's going to be a gap in terms of the satisfaction of citizens with their government. And the citizens are not going to understand who's to blame except for the city for not giving them what they said that they wanted, even though the city can't give them what they said that they wanted. Then we have the political, the little p political argument that some feel that businesses and outside interests are using state control as a means to circumvent local preferences regarding how businesses operate in the community. And this has been a real issue on the shared economy, like Airbnb, particularly in tourist-oriented communities. Florida has been the hotbed of this one, even though it's also been an issue here in Arizona, where you have these beach communities, for instance, and owners of properties will use Airbnb to rent out those properties, but the people who actually live there hate that because of who it is that's coming in to actually rent those properties and party and make lots of noise and generally not treat the property as well as they probably should, which has implications for the property values of the neighbors who do live there. So the ability of the citizens to say, oh, I think we should actually limit this. If you don't rent for at least 5 days or at least 1 month, then we're not going to allow those short-term rentals. That's a very common local regulation that's been tried, and state legislatures are coming back saying, no, Airbnb, you're going to let them do their thing, and you don't get to say that they can't, because we want to have a blanket statewide regulation for that, as if an electronic product like Airbnb could not adapt to local regulations, which of course they can, and they do, because they have to do this in Europe also. So the argument that you're going to get, that we need this uniformity, is rather specious. We can tailor things, but there's an industry. There are a lot of lobbying interests out there that are working with legislators to make sure that certain regulations are standardized because they want to lower their costs. This is what businesses do. You can't fault them for that. They're playing the game. But there are also these other interests out there that are more idealistic, ideologically driven, like ALEC, which is the American Legislative Exchange Council. American Legislative Exchange Council. So it's a think tank. It's made up of state legislators from around the country who derive things like model preemption legislation for states to adopt, for things like the rollout of 5G telecommunications infrastructure. Just as a random example that has nothing to do with Arizona. Actually, it has a lot to do with Arizona. The idea that you do not get to regulate the utilization of our public infrastructure by private companies for their profiting. That you're going to do this very below market rate for them to rent space on our utilities, our public utilities. That's a real challenge. And interestingly enough, that survey that I mentioned before that I showed you where the trust levels are also included a question with regards to why people think that there's so much preemption going on, and 70% of the respondents said that of registered voters, this is not all citizens, this is just registered voters, the ones who matter, they believe that preemption happens frequently or sometimes due to corporate and special interests and lobbyists convincing state lawmakers to preempt local laws to protect their profits. Yeah, we're pretty cynical. And one of the reasons that we like local government so much is because we get less of that happening at the local level. But a lot of attention by lobbying firms today, if you look at the spending that lobbying firms are spending, a lot of it is now targeted at state legislators, even more so than federal legislators. Because a lot of this action is happening at the state, and they're making great inroads into being able to create these blanket policies that override the variation in local preferences. And then I have one of my favorite quotes out of this Florida town of Lake Clark by one of their city councilors who said, "It's been touted that the legislators, know better than we do." Wrong. Absolutely wrong. And of course he says it way more emphatically in the actual interview. We know what's best for our neighborhoods. We know what's best for our constituency. We live it every day. Of course, we're there, and it's impossible for folks in the State House to be familiar with all the nuances and the variations that exist across the state as a whole. It just is impossible. So there we are. We have these two fundamentally different philosophical approaches to local government, even though, again, they bleed together. The question is, how do we strike the balance? This argument that local governments know best is something that citizens know as well. They have a gut feel for this. In that same poll from the AGL Moore poll from earlier this year, 58% said that they believe local governments are more connected to the community's needs and can pass policies that better reflect the community's values. This is not shocking. It's not rocket science. We live it. We see, okay, there's a pothole that needs repaired. Well, if you live in El Paso, Texas, and you get a pothole, you're going to call the State House in Austin? Do you think they know about your pothole? Do you think they care about your pothole? Now, City Hall, more likely to be responsive to something like that. Your city councilor, in whose district you live, more likely to maybe even know about that pothole. So they're able to work with Public Works to get that fixed on a quicker basis than probably Austin would be able to do. Also, this is not political. Democrats and Republicans alike agree on this. So this is not a political issue. And you'll see again, I'm going to drive this point home again here in a bit, that at this local versus state thing frequently gets put into a political framework, mainly here in Arizona, mainly because we have a Republican legislature, and the perception is, well, the Republican legislature, Republicans are doing this to local government. Well, it's a little bit more complicated than that, particularly as we look at what's going on in some other states. So that takes us to where we are today and some of the work that we've been doing in this. We've looked at the work, extending some of the work that the National League of Cities has done, and they found in their study, it goes back to 2011, that there has been an increase in preemption. Shocking. We kind of knew this, but here's the highlights of what they found. They found that 24 states during that period had preempted some aspect of a minimum wage. They found that 17 have preempted some form of paid leave benefits. 3 have preempted some form of home sharing. Just in that period of time. That number has gone up to 8 now, I believe, the states that have actually passed bans on local government. So this is already a year old. This came out in January, I believe, the national report did. No, the original report came out a year ago, and it was updated this year. But since the original, we're up to 8 states now that have done that. 37 preempt some form of local control of safety standards for ride-sharing corporations like Uber and Lyft. 17 preempt low-cost broadband service. Now, some states encourage this. Colorado is a state that's allowing local governments to experiment with local broadband access, which lowers costs to access for lower-income individuals, which improves quality of educational opportunities for low-income kids. 42 preempt local officials' authority to increase taxes to meet local needs. Again, it's all about who controls the finances. So they were focusing on these particular areas, and we kind of cast a bit of a wider net. We also went back further in time to look at the legislation that has been passed from 2001 to 2017, to mid-2017. We're still working on updating that now. But we looked at 8 states on all their preemptions, and we looked at all states on their preemptions specifically aimed at minimum wage and telecommunications preemptions. And what we found in just that kind of narrow slice was 167 laws, things that had been passed, not proposals. There's even way more proposals than there are actual laws that get passed, covering a wide range of these policy areas. We're fleshing this out to look at all policy areas across all states over this period of time. But what we found already with just particularly this first cut was pretty clear evidence of a very sharp rise in the number of preemptions that are actually occurring across the country. Preemptions, restrictions where local governments are being told to do something or being preempted from doing something. The pattern is really clear, and as we are gathering additional data, we're finding just more cases of it. So I don't know if the line is going to get any more steep as we continue to collect the data, but certainly it's not getting any flatter as we collect more data. Now, some of the interesting things about this, I told you before, it's not about the politics. I mean, think about this for a second. Many of you in here probably identify with the Republican Party. One of the fundamental premises of the Republican platform has historically been local control. This has always been the idea of pushing power closest to the individual. Individual autonomy has been a core principle of the Republican Party for years. So why would Republican legislators across so many states be gathering up this information, this power back to the state houses? It's not just the Republicans. What matters, if you want to try and understand what actually matters and try and predict more preemptive behavior, you've got to look at who controls which parts of state government. And when you have one party that controls the state house, state senate, and the governor's house, when you have a trifecta, which is what political scientists call it. I'm more of a sports guy. I call it a hat trick. So if you control all 3 of those, regardless of your party, you're more likely to see preemptive behaviors by that legislature. Now, it just so happens that right now we're at a point in our history where Republicans have a lot more of these trifectas than Democrats. But Democrats have several too. And both parties who have these trifectas are the ones who are, this is the Republican trifectas, these are the Democratic trifectas. So about 75% of the preemptions that we're seeing today are being conducted by states that had a trifecta in power at the time that it was passed. Republican or Democrat. I told you about New York already, that case, and I've told you a little bit about California already. We certainly have seen it here in Arizona. There's a lot of examples of where parties actually are facing some inconsistencies in their own rhetoric, their own political rhetoric, mainly because it's not about party, it's about power. So the concentration of power, and when parties control all the instruments of power, you see that concentration begin to gravitate towards that level of government. So that was a big surprise for us, because we also thought, based on what we were hearing from all the rhetoric floating around over the last several years, that it's the Republicans. They're just gathering up all this power, which did not make sense given the political philosophy of the Republican Party. So now that when we look at these data and we say, oh, it's not, the Democrats are doing it too, but only when one or the other party has total control of the different state chambers. So that was useful to understand. It's not going to be part of it, and that has implications for how it is that you decide how to work with legislatures in terms of trying to at least stop the preemptions, if not get some of those responsibilities and powers back. Okay, so we talked a little bit about the history, how we got here. What I want to shift to now is this framework for helping local governments actually see where they fit. And this is what we've been doing nationally, is to help local officials understand where they fit as they are trying to identify what to do as they are facing these challenges from their state legislature. So I'll talk a little bit here about the nature of the actions that states and local governments can take, and how it's framed by the legal structure in which they're sitting. And basically this comes in three different flavors. These, how a state affects local government, it will take one of three different ways. One is they can permit local action, and we have seen several examples of where states have actually expanded local control. So it's not all doom and gloom. There have been specific examples of where states have expanded local control.
Can you be specific on that, particularly in Arizona?
Oh, no, Arizona, I'm sorry. They don't get anything. No, Arizona has been much more narrowly focused with regards to... And again, it also depends on how it is that you define permitting, because, so let's go back to the 5G rollout, right? This is not something that was specified in legislative language up to within the last year. So this is something new, and local governments were trying, Tempe was a really good example of this, was trying to set some standards with regards to how they could charge for utilization of these public right-of-ways and public utility infrastructure, so that the companies could put their equipment on those poles. This is in the absence of any state prohibitions about that, or guidance. Then the state gets involved, and they say, you're not going to be able to charge the market rates, you're going to charge this flat fee, and you're going to make it available to everybody, and you're going to be responsible for the equipment that's on those poles, even though it's not your equipment, which is really odd in terms of some liability issues. But this was and also how those specifications were created, who participated in the creation of that legislation. It's really interesting. It goes back to the role of corporate interest and lobbying going on. So if you think about this, some people would argue that that was an example of the state permitting local governments from getting involved in the 5G space. I would disagree with that interpretation, but that argument has been made that was an example of how the legislature is permitting local governments to play in different policy areas. But of course, they're permitting them to play in a policy area in exactly the way the state tells them they will play in that policy area, which is not really what we mean by autonomy. That's not my definition of autonomy, at least. Yeah, the legislature has been very stingy about that in Arizona. Like I said, we are unfortunately facing the worst of the predilections towards preemption relative to the other states. And there's not a whole lot of silver lining in terms of the future until we see some changes in who is in the legislature, where there may be some open opportunities then to build some new bridges with some new legislators that are maybe less inclined to start to take away these local authorities. So permitting is one thing that local governments or that state legislatures can do. Restricting local action is what we see a lot of. This is the preemptions, but it's not just preemption. We'll get into preemption versus some of the other restrictions. And then there's the requirements that local governments will do, like the 5G rollout. The handout that you have has a copy of these in there, so you can take this with you, these three different types. And again, as we've been working with communities across the nation, we've been working with communities that are Dillon rule states, and we've been working with those that are home rule states. And we've been more on the home rule side in Arizona, but we have certainly drifted much more towards the Dillon rule side now. So again, think of these as a spectrum, not a dichotomous choice, even though in the handout it's kind of given as a dichotomous situation. These permissions typically fall in broad or specific specifications. If it's Dillon's rule state, typically you're given an express power to a city in a form of a charter of some sort, and that's, again, we have our charter cities here in Arizona as well. And a home rule state is a much more broad authorization. Instead of targeting a specific city, states can actually permit an entire, all cities to do this thing. I'll give you an example of the specific legislation in Indiana, for instance, where the city of Bloomington, Indiana, which is home of Indiana University, so it's a college town, about 50,000 residents, separate from the university itself. They were going to annex, as the largest annexation that they'd ever done in their history. It was a significant annexation. They were going to, they were banking on a lot of infrastructure to be spent in the development of that area. And of course, this was also to capture some of the tax base that had grown up around the city to escape the city taxes and still utilize the city's infrastructure. So there was a spending bill that was going through the state legislature, and around midnight, and I'm not even making this up, on like December 30th of last year, if I remember the date correctly, there was a little rider tucked in on this, the midnight rider. I mean, we teach this stuff in poli-sci, and you think it's theoretical. It ain't theoretical. This was truly a midnight rider that said, we're going to suspend for 5 years all annexation activity by local governments within the state. So it's a blanket preemption, in a sense, targeted at one city, because there was only one annexation underway in the entire state at the time. So it wasn't by accident. It was targeted specifically at Bloomington to stop them from doing this, and that legislator happened to be a business owner in the area that was being annexed. Shocking as that sounds. So that's an example of using this kind of broad language to affect a specific jurisdiction. Now, another way that we do this is, and again, another Indiana example, is Fort Wayne, Indiana wanted to do a county option income tax. Fort Wayne is in Allen County, it's in the northeast corner of the state. And they wanted to do this county option income tax, but they didn't have the authority to do it. Remember who controls this is a Dillon's rule state, who controls the purse strings, controls policy, so they had to get permission. And the way the state granted the permission in that particular case, they wanted to affect just Allen County. So they said any county in the state can do this if their population is between these two numbers. So it was there's only one county that happens to fit that. They did it again with, I forget what they were trying to do, but they narrowed the criterion for it was that you have to be a consolidated city county. There's exactly one consolidated city county in Indianapolis, Marion County. So this was something that Indianapolis wanted to do, and the state legislature wanted to make sure they were the only ones that could do it. This is the way that operates. They can also do, so you can limit or target legislation to to give permission to do these things by being very creative, because you can't just say one city and name that city unless you're in a Dillon's rule state. And if home rule state, you have to use these more broad terms in order to, but in a way that only one meets those terms, only one jurisdiction meets those terms. Yeah.
Haven't there been some suits though that have challenged those, and the challenger actually won it because they showed that this was targeted?
Yeah, exactly. So remember I mentioned a minute ago the importance of the word corporation. This is important for legal reasons, because a corporation in the United States, particularly in the post People's United court case, this was even driven home even further, because now then, because of that court case, oddly enough to deal with campaign financing, has implications for what's called commandeering. It's a legal concept, and I don't know if we're going to go down the rabbit hole too far on that, but this idea that states can commandeer a corporation, a legally incorporated corporation, which is what a municipality is, to do certain things. That is becoming, and it's kind of I'll talk more about this a little bit as we go along, that is one of the things where local governments are beginning to hang their hat, and there are some cases now that are being heard in federal courts that are addressing that very issue under the federal statute of commandeering corporations, which means it would supersede state law. So there's a little glimmer of hope, and a lot of local governments, a lot of leagues are looking at these cases very closely, because this could be the camel's nose under the tent. Yeah.
So does the state decide to be a Dillon's rule state or a home rule state? Is that under statute, or
the state?
It's an assessment that you've made based on behavior?
It's not. Some states actually do. They don't call it Dillon's rule. There's actually there are statutes that define what they do and don't do, but some actually do come out and say that they are a home rule state. There are home rule legislation that exists usually in the state constitution. So it is the state as a whole that decides this, and it is a legal structure of an entire state's governance system, what we've done, and what a lot of scholars have done, is to say, okay, well, you do these things, that means you're more on this end of the home rule spectrum, or you do these things, and you're more on the Dillon's rule spectrum. There are only 10 states that the National League of Cities classified as traditional home rule states anymore. We're down to that few. We were up to 27 once upon a time. But things have been, that gravitational, the pendulum, if you will, has swung pretty hard to the Dillon's rule side. And there, again, we are leading that swing, even though we have traditionally been in a home rule state. Okay, so that's permission. Don't get a lot of that here, but some states are getting more of that. Well, we typically see more of these days across all states, but certainly here in Arizona, and egregiously here in Arizona, given 1478, are these restrictions, A7, sorry, these restrictions that take different forms. Preemption is only one of those forms. Preemption, these restrictions can take several different forms, and this again is in the handout, so if you want to have that handy with you. But omission is one way in which these restrictions can manifest. Is if you are in a Dillon's rule state, the state can simply omit giving you that authority. Then you don't get it. That's the thing about Dillon's rule. If you don't explicitly have that authority, you don't have that authority. So by omitting it, you are prevented from effectively utilizing that authority. And I need my glasses. The one thing I've really not liked about aging. Okay, so targeted restrictions are another one where we have seen. Before I go on, let me start with. I'll go back to New York City as another example on this omission. So New York City, a home rule city, had tried under Bloomberg's administration, and has tried again under the current mayor, has wanted to do some traffic control, some congestion pricing for cars in Manhattan, which, if you've ever tried to drive in Manhattan, you know is a nightmare. And so they want to limit the number of cars in there, particularly because of the advent of Uber and Lyft, which has actually increased traffic in Manhattan. So there was nothing to stop them from doing this. They wanted to use the congestion pricing to fund highway repairs in other parts of the city, and it would curb traffic in Manhattan. It was kill two birds with one stone. The legislature and Governor Cuomo said, no, you're not going to do that. That's not a power that you have. And then they said, but it doesn't matter, we're a home rule city. So the legislature passed a law specifically preventing them from doing that. So it was a very targeted restriction saying cities in New York cannot, cities of a particular population cannot utilize congestion taxes, or these fees, I forget the technical name they were using, for highway funds, highway repair funds. So they narrowed that down. So now that the city's gone back and is trying to get around that, given the language that was in that piece of legislation, to say, okay, well, we'll use it for something else. And then we'll fungibly move these other funds to help on the highways. And they're playing those games, and that's where we are right now. But again, it's targeted legislation specifically aimed at one jurisdiction and one policy area. So it's very surgical, if you will. Another targeted restriction example, Orange County, North Carolina, is a community that's been denied its power to charge impact fees on developers to provide funds for the educational system. Now, this is interesting. This is not a preemption. This is a targeted restriction because the legislators believed that the fees were excessive. But when they targeted the restriction at Orange County, they did not prevent other local governments in North Carolina from using development fees, these impact fees. So they can still do it, but Orange County can't, because they charged too many. So it's like they broke the rules. They're in timeout right now. They don't get to use impact fees for a while, which actually could be good for Orange County because they need some development. So maybe they'll attract more developers that aren't having to pay those fees. I mentioned a little bit about the Bloomington example, but I want to talk a little bit about nullification. This is always a tricky topic in the South. I used to teach at Clemson University, where many of the buildings in the state and several of the buildings actually on campus are dedicated to, and where John Calhoun is actually buried. John Calhoun was the vice president under John Quincy Adams, if I remember correctly, who led the charge for nullification of the Union that led to a certain scuffle that we had back in the 1800s. So nullification in the South is a really touchy subject, but nullification when it comes to local governments is very common. This is where the courts are actually getting involved and passing judgment on pieces of state legislation, which goes to the point you were making before. If these court cases say in no state you have overreached, you can't do that, then that's a nullification in favor of local governments. But more often than not, as we've seen in Arizona, we're seeing the courts are actually siding with the state legislature and saying, no, local government, you can't do that. State law is pretty clear. You can't melt your guns. That's in violation of the legislation we passed in 2016. So nullification through courts is one of those ways that we restrict this, and that's the way that Judge Dillon actually originally wanted the system to work. He wanted the legal branch to do the adjudication and decide on a case-by-case basis what these were. So this is actually much more the historical view of how local governments were supposed to have been operating. Now this is also one of those areas where we see the legislature getting involved as well. So the legislature in North Carolina, when they saw that bathroom bill come out of Charlotte, nullified that specific ordinance. And in so doing, also created a preemption, which I'll come back to in just a second. This broadest form of preemption, this broadest form of restriction, rather, is preemption. Because a preemption is not just to say to one jurisdiction, no, you can't do this, but rather, no jurisdiction can do this. So even if it's something that you've never done before, we just had one of these here in the state, and the governor signed off on with regards to pet stores, and said, even though this is not an issue, we're not going to let you get into this area. So it's a preemption that was kind of unnecessary because it wasn't a thing yet. No one was actually doing it, and that's actually not uncommon either. Many times these are actually called ceiling preemptions. Again, I don't want to go too far down the legal side of this, but usually what the states will do is that there's some floor of performance that cities have to do, a minimum wage, and you have to meet that minimum wage and those requirements for that. But some states do allow their communities to say, well, we could have a higher minimum wage. So there's a floor preemption, which is kind of this is what you have to do. But what we're seeing a lot more now of is these ceiling preemptions, which is you can't go beyond what we've said in state law. This is the state minimum wage. This is your ceiling. It's also your floor. You will do this. So sometimes this idea of preemption is more specifically referred to, particularly by legal scholars, as ceiling preemptions. And a good example of this is Prop 13 out of California, the infamous Prop 13, which limited the amount of increase that you could have annually in your property tax bill. So this limits, even though inflation may considerably exceed what you're allowed to increase your property tax rates to accommodate. So again, controlling finances is one of those things, and we see that here in Arizona also, just with the caps that we face. Unlike nullifying or overriding existing local law, preemption occurs before a local government is actually put in a particular policy. So if we go back to that bathroom bill in North Carolina, yes, they nullified the ordinance in Charlotte, but they preempted every other jurisdiction in the state from passing a similar transgendered bathroom bill. So that, again, the impact was much broader than the original intent, I think, that the legislature intended. And it also had not just bathrooms, but all those other worker compensation issues, worker benefit issues that were part of the original Charlotte legislation as well, the original ordinance that the city council had passed. Now, so they were combined. And another example of that would be Denton, Texas, who had the fracking bill that they did, where the legislature nullified the ban that Denton had passed, but then also preempted all other cities from doing that. So now in a community like Arlington, Texas, in the middle of Dallas and Fort Worth, you've got fracking drills in the city. I mean, in neighborhoods. I grew up in Arlington, and I go back there. I still have family and friends there, and I drive through and I say, that used to be Bill's house. It's a drill with a little pond next to it. And the other thing about it is, I, having grown up there, never experienced an earthquake. Now then, they're a daily occurrence. Literally, it's amazing what, these are the kind of the implications that go along with this. And Oklahoma is even much worse in terms of the proliferation of fracking equipment in residential areas of cities. So that was another example of where an individual local ordinance was nullified, but a preemption grew out of it. So that's not uncommon at all. There was a wage increase in St. Louis, again, a minimum wage issue back in 2015. St. Louis, Missouri, that passed an increase in their minimum wage that, again, overturned by the state legislature and then preempted the rest of Missouri from doing anything similar. A bag ban, Laredo, Texas, again, because this is one that ties to Arizona. Laredo, Texas had passed a bag ban, and the state legislature, Supreme Court nullified that law. Then the legislature came along and banned it for all the cities, and the governor came then out and said, because nullification and preemption wasn't enough, there were 8 other cities that had already passed other bans, and they said if they don't rescind those bans, a la Brisbane, we're going to suspend your general revenue funds. Your shared revenue funds, rather. So they've got the club ready to club them over the head if they don't take the plastic ban off. And to tie it back to the corporate interest on this, who's pushing plastic? Who loves plastic bags? Well, there's an entire industry based on plastics, which is tied to petroleum. I mean, they were invented by Mobil Oil. That's who brought them to the United States in the 70s to begin with. So there are these corporate interests, again, they're woven into a lot of our state legislatures that are advocating for very specific kinds of bans on bans, our preemptions, our restrictions on local governments, to create this environment within which they can do business. Again, they're not breaking any rules. This is what they should be doing. Whether the legislators should be reacting the way that they're reacting is another question, and what citizens don't have is the information about what's being done. So there's a huge information asymmetry that is facilitating the ability of many corporate lobbying interests to fly kind of beneath the radar. Our media also does not give as much attention, particularly in other states. Arizona's actually one of the better states in this regard, but a lot of states don't have the kind of capital coverage that we have, or that even Texas has. That's one of the issues. Let's see how we're doing on time here. Yeah. So we've got... Wow, okay. Let me jump, because I want to make sure we have time to talk about these solutions and then set some questions. So what can we do about this? I was almost there. What can we do about this? There are 6 basic actions that we've seen across the nation. And the bad news is, for Arizona, that bill, it just is paralytic. It's very difficult for local governments in Arizona to do any of these things. When we first presented this to our national group of about 100 city managers and mayors last October, when we started sharing this chart, and we had a couple of case studies that they did as homework coming into this workshop. We had a weekend-long workshop. They just sunk their teeth into this topic for an entire weekend, which was fantastic. Some great discussions come out of that. But one of the interesting things about it was their first reaction to these 2 cases was fight, defiance. We're going to do it anyway. That's great rhetoric and maybe psychologically feel good, but the reality is, particularly in Arizona, that simply is going to be a very dangerous path to go down, simply because you are running the risk, like Bisbee did, like Tucson did, of being really popped by the legislature. Financial penalties. to your jurisdiction. Some significant, particularly for smaller jurisdictions. It doesn't take a lot, given the margins and the budgets that our local governments face are simply not that robust. We typically raise pretty close to what we need. So defiance is really a very high risk, particularly in Arizona. Not so much in other states, but certainly in Arizona. We're using the legal powers to test these limits, going to the courts. And that's what Brisbee did. But we have a Supreme Court that's pretty, empathetic to the state, much more so than to local governments, in Arizona specifically. Again, other states, they're having some luck with this. The corporate argument that I was talking about before, this commandeering concept, if communities in other states are successful in using this argument, that argument will apply here as well. Because again, that's federal and it would supersede state. And so local corporations may be able to do certain things under their corporate guise that would allow them, even though there's state legislation saying they can't. So the state cannot commandeer a corporation. Therefore, the local corporation can do X, Y, and Z, or whatever those things happen to be for those communities. The referendum. This is where we've actually had some success here recently in Arizona, both on minimum wage, certainly with the education issue. But it's a challenge. You got to mobilize a lot of people, and that's not what we typically do in city councils. Typically, not what we do in the city manager's office. It's not rallying the troops, so to speak, to get a statewide issue passed. It would require a lot of working together to do something like that, which again is really useful when you have advocacy groups that can operate in partnership with you. But we're kind of busy trying to keep the lights on in the city, in towns, that makes this kind of effort difficult unless somebody is willing to kind of take the lead on that. The workaround. This is the one that we're seeing the most success in right now. The workaround takes a lot of different forms. One example from a colleague of mine that works in the county, Hennepin County, Minnesota. They were discussing, the state legislature was talking about a bathroom bill, just like North Carolina. So this is Minnesota of all places, progressive Minnesota. They were talking about a bathroom bill, and so in order to diffuse even the possibility that this was going to become an issue for Hennepin County, they were doing some renovations and just made single-use, non-sex bathrooms. So they didn't have, they had single stalls, basically, an individual bathroom that were separate. So anybody could use whichever bathroom because there's no one else going to be in there. The bathroom bill only applies to group bathrooms. Nice, simple workaround. Durham, North Carolina, trying to offset some of those higher assessments that they were being required to collect, decided that they were going to provide some tax relief to citizens that met certain qualifications who just happened to live in those affordable housing units that the city had and were trying to protect. The request for additional powers. This is one of those areas where local governments can say, yeah, we would like permission to do this. You go into the state legislature and asking us. Now, the thing about that is that you're tipping your hand because first off, you're asking permission, which puts the power in the state legislature and admits that you don't have that power, as opposed to doing it and asking for forgiveness later, which is what, again, a lot of jurisdictions and other states are doing, but we have this added bonus that other states aren't facing right now. So it makes it a little challenging for us. Then there's the advocacy and voluntary efforts approach, and this is where the league plays an incredibly important role. The professional organizations that can actually work with local governments to be their advocate, to be their lobbyist, if you will. And even that role is kind of tricky. I mean, because you have a lot of different constituencies across the state. And you're trying to speak truth to power to a group that may not be sympathetic to the argument because it's not even on their radar. Local autonomy is simply just not an issue for many of the state legislators here. But that's where the most success we're seeing is workarounds and working with state league offices around the country and developing those relationships with your local delegates in the state legislature so that when a piece of legislation comes that's going to directly affect your jurisdiction, you have a champion who's actually going to be more sensitive to the impact it's going to have upon your local jurisdiction. Because of time, I'm going to stop there and say, just kind of open it up for questions for the remaining time that we have. I covered a lot, but I want to give you a chance to dive into some of the specifics that you all may be facing. And you want to kick it off, Tom?
Thank you, David.
Sure.
It seems that based upon your surveys and results, and that the best thing we can do to slow down the action of the control being taken away, the home rule conversion over to the judge, is have a split legislature.
I wasn't going to come out and say it like that, but yeah, I mean, quite frankly, one of the things, exactly, one of the things, and it's not just the legislature, but it could be the governorship. It's just that one of not having a trifecta is, the idea that one of the things that can protect against more of these preemptions is a split state government in terms of party control, is that at least the governorship or one of the chambers is held by a different party, and that typically slows things down considerably. We've seen that a huge change in North Carolina now because of that, because they got a Democratic governor who is not signing these preemption bills the way that Governor McCrory was up until last year. So that can have a big impact. And of course, how do local governments go about creating a split? And again, not electing the entire other party into those positions of power, but rather just one of those houses, one of those chambers, or the governor's house. It's tricky to do that. And is that really the role of local government? And that's the other fundamental question, or philosophical question, is you all have a tactical value there, but is that really appropriate for the local governments to be championing, say, X number of candidates for the state house in order to switch the overall party affiliation?
We're not partisan generally.
Exactly.
It's tricky. But you see on a national scale in Congress,
Yeah, exactly.
people tend to think, you know what, if we have a split legislature, they at least can't pass more laws and make it.
Yeah, no, exactly.
We've got enough laws, so if we don't want more laws passed, just keep it.
Slow it down, exactly.
Depending on the time, we have about one or two more questions. Steve, go ahead.
Wow.
Could you take a look at how many of these legislators, or how many legislative bodies, how many of them had a lot of local government people who sit in the legislature?
Yeah. In other states, it's a lot more than Arizona. We were just talking before that we started here at how few local officials are in the Arizona legislature, which I had no idea it was that few. How many were you saying? Three Republicans?
I think I was trying to think off the top of my head, so I'd have to go through our book, but off the top of my head, there's about 4 Republican members of the legislature that were former council members or in city government. There might be more than that, but I can only think of 4 off the top of my head.
So it's a very small number, but in other legislatures, you have extraordinarily high numbers of, relatively high, I should say, not extraordinary, relatively high numbers of local officials who have gone on into the state legislatures. But those...
Do you find that made a difference?
We haven't looked at that, in all honesty. That's a really great question. It's kind of a poli-sci question, but it's but we should, that would be interesting to do. Getting data that goes back as far as we have gone back and on the legislation side is a little tricky in that regard, but it would be a really interesting question to see if it matters, because then there's another argument then for many of you all who are on council to maybe think about, stepping up to the next level, so to speak, and still representing the local interest of the jurisdiction, the districts that you serve. That's one of the things about that legislation that allows representatives to reach across the state and interfere with things that are going on in other communities. It just is that other state leagues are absolutely appalled by, and as are we.
We have time for one more question. Mayor Smith, go ahead.
Thank you. I'm the mayor of Disney. I think it's might be interesting that all of the 1487 challenges that have come in, none of them have been from legislators in
the
areas.
Exactly.
Every single one of them has been a legislator in Maricopa County that has made that challenge. Now, I do believe that some of those locals haven't had the guts to stand up and have had their cohorts in the Phoenix area do that. But I think it's just an interesting observation.
Yeah, so Mayor Smith mentioned that many of the claims for 1487 have not come from the legislator in the district. Slight correction, one of the claims of the 11 have come from the legislator within the district. The Tucson gun ban claim, that legislator has a very small piece of Tucson that is within their district, but the majority of Tucson is in other districts. So yeah, it's technicality. But, yeah.
And that's where we got really close this year. Well, I say really close. We made some headway with the piece that was going to limit the ability to have the AG do these investigations. You had to be in that district, and even that didn't work. So hopefully that'll come back.
I just wanted to thank David for his time. Thank you all for your attendance. As we said, the information from the slideshow is available online, and as most of you have received, he had a handout as well. So thank you.
Good luck.
Thank you.